Hello and welcome to Gendering Geopolitics, my quick series where I have 10-minute conversations with women who are doing amazing things around the world. My name is Emily Prey, and I'm a senior analyst at the New Lines Institute in Washington, D.C. Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Nima Elbagir, a senior international correspondent at CNN, about the war in Ethiopia and the Tigray Genocide. Tomorrow, November 4th, marks the one-year anniversary of the fighting. So thank you so much for joining me, Nima.
Thank you.
You were in Sudan a few months ago reporting on the war in neighboring Ethiopia. What was the sense that you got when you were there? Is there any end in sight?
Well, I think what we are viewing currently in terms of how fast the situation on the ground is moving with this alliance between the Oromia forces and the Tigrayan forces, then separately what we're seeing from the speed with which territory is being taken by those combined forces. Many of those we're speaking to at the moment are saying that combined fighting force is right on the outskirts of Addis. So I think the military reality on the ground is overtaking how I felt back then in August when we were in Sudan. When we were in Sudan in August, it felt horrifyingly like potentially there was no end in sight, because all of the attempts by the international community to, at the very least, even get some censure out of the United Nations Security Council were being obstructed by actors like China and Russia, but also regional allies within the African and Arab states. So when we went there at a very specific time when there were mass incarcerations, mass arrests just over the border with Sudan in Tigray, in Western Tigray, specifically in Humera. And we were actually there when bodies of those that had been killed in Humera and in that conflict were arriving. And so I think if I try and compare where we were in terms of our thinking on this conflict with where we were then and where we were now, it's very clear that the military reality on the ground has overtaken the geopolitical attempts to constrain it, or the geopolitical attempts to stop the parties on the ground from pursuing that military solution. And unfortunately, it doesn't matter how many times you say there is no military solution to this conflict. The reality is, if the only thing that forcibly moves the lived circumstances of people on the ground has been the military movement on the ground by the Tigrayan forces and others, then I think from the perspective of the international community, their handling of Ethiopia has sent a really bad message to others in the region and beyond.
And so looking at the recent UN reports, no convoys with humanitarian supplies have entered Tigray since October 18th, and fuel for the humanitarian response hasn't entered the region since early August. Abiy Ahmed's government has totally cut off the region. What is the international community doing to address this?
From where we're sitting, it really does appear like what they've done is consistently raised these flags and banners of concern. I think, again, we come back to this place where what's become very clear is that the geopolitical and global equilibrium really has not been reset post Trump administration isolationism, post the waves of populism in Europe and beyond, where you've had these leaders and actors in these countries saying, well, we only care about what happens in our own countries, and we will not do what is morally correct. We will do what is expedient for our national interests. And this is another example of that. The fact that the UN Security Council could be so immobilized, could have been so frozen for months by the use of the veto by China and Russia, but also by the just the state of stasis that actors within the UN Security Council and outside of the UN Security Council have frozen the international community into, I think is incredibly worrying. What has happened in Tigray breaks, in addition to, the fact that it is a war crime, it also very clearly breaks Resolution 2417 regarding the use of starvation as a weapon of war. And yet the UN Security Council did nothing. And beyond the the fears that we all have and that aid workers have for the people in Tigray right now who have no food, who are, I don't think desperate really is even the appropriate word, who are incredibly, incredibly desperate. I think we also, many of us, fear for what this says about the ability of the global community to come together and stop atrocities from happening.
I'm glad that you brought up national interests because I actually did an episode with Dr. Evelina Ohab on the Tigray Genocide a few months ago. And one of the things that she said was that the international community isn't paying enough attention to what's happening because it's happening in Africa. So how can this war and this genocide potentially destabilize the entire region? And is that what it takes to finally get the rest of the world to care?
Unfortunately, I think there is a part of this that is about the broader region and the regional contagion. So you have Sudan and the impact of taking on refugees and how it has impacted Sudan economically. Although what we saw when we went to the border, and other journalists saw when they went to the border, not just me because I'm Sudanese, is that a lot of Sudanese families were opening their homes and taking in Tigrayan refugees, and that those cross-border links actually resulted in people, just people, being more generous and more willing to help than the global community has been. I don't 100% know that I would agree entirely with the fact that what is happening in Ethiopia is ignored because it's in Africa. I think that this idea of this issue being in Africa, being weaponized, has been very cleverly utilized by the Ethiopian government to actually say the opposite, to say that the US and other Western powers are trying to involve themselves in Ethiopia because they are imperialists who are trying to sanction a poor African state. So I think I'm always very careful about falling into that rhetoric trap, although often it is very true that if this was happening on the doorsteps of Europe, if this was happening somewhere closer to home for many of these countries, then yeah, absolutely, there would have been a more immediate response. But I think with Ethiopia, it's much more complicated than that. I think what has happened is that the US and other governments have put a higher price on regional stability, on what will happen if Ethiopia fractures, and if this becomes Ethiopia's balkanizing moment. I think that has been the bigger issue, because otherwise there's no other justification for how many chances, how many periods of grace the Biden administration has given the Ethiopians to resolve this, as the administration keeps saying, when there has been all this incredibly credible evidence that what is happening in Ethiopia bears all the hallmarks of genocide.
In August, Amnesty International released a report on the sexual violence that's taking place in Tigray. And in the report, they said that the violations amount to war crimes and may amount to crimes against humanity. What they did not say is that all of the counted or uncounted instances of sexual violence and rape may also amount to genocide, as you just mentioned. And in my opinion, they do. So can you talk briefly about the sexual violence that's being perpetrated by various actors in Ethiopia against women, particularly in Tigray, and why it's so important to listen to these victim survivors?
Because genocide is about intent, right? Genocide is about the intent to destroy in whole or part. And that intent is not just through murdering. It's not just through the use of weaponry and targeting people's physical bodies. It is also through these ideas of cleansing the bloodline. It's through diluting the presence of people and their ability to continue as a people. And what we have seen, because we've been following this right from the beginning, is very clear stages of the weaponizing of rape and the targeting of women. So in the beginning, what we were hearing from victims was that women were targeted for beatings and humiliation. And that is obviously awful. Then when towns were taken over, what we began hearing is about the rapes and the sexual violence against women. And not just sexual violence as an unfortunate, tragical, as an unfortunate tragedy of war, something that happens when there is a lack of security and when women are placed in these appallingly insecure contexts, but actually intentional sexual violence as part and parcel of the way that the war was being prosecuted. That these women were telling us that they were being told that this is how Tigrayan women should be treated. And that then we started hearing that they were being told that we will cleanse your bloodline. We will make sure that Tigrayan wombs do not carry Tigrayan children, don't bear Tigrayan children. And it is your honor that this should happen to you. And for me, it felt very close to home because it reminded me of what I heard from female survivors, from victims in Darfur, that they were being told by the Janjaweed, by the Arab tribal militias there, that it is your honor to be raped. It is your honor for us to cleanse your bloodline. And that's why when we heard it for the first time, I immediately knew that this was part of the way that they were prosecuting this war, not a tragic consequence of the war. And that is what rape as a weapon of war is. It is part of the infrastructure of war. And then in March, we began hearing about the sexual slavery, women being held in Eritrean and Ethiopian army camps, women being raped using implements, the humiliation that had been slowly growing, where the rape was very public, women being forcibly raped by family members, and why this is so important with regards to proving genocide in this context. Now, I'm not a legal body. I don't get to make that designation. So what we have been saying is that the evidence that we have seen bears the hallmarks of genocide, because that's not our designation to make. But when you're talking about genocide, often people talk about finding command papers or finding orders written down somewhere. But the way that the carrying out of the orders is done almost simultaneously by the forces on the ground, in and of itself actually can and has been used as evidence of genocide. So what we saw here is that there were very clear turns in that use of rape as a weapon of war. So the attacks, then the rapes, then the public rapes, then the rapes where family members were forced to rape the women in their family, then the sexual slavery where women were taken and held as sexual slaves and raped repeatedly inside these camps, and then the use of implements and the publicizing, the taking of trophy videos and trophy pictures, the way that those the ways that those different weapons, different means of raping were used, and were used very homogeneously across different forces, in and of itself speaks to very clear guidelines of intent. It can, in a court of law or in a tribunal or in a prosecutory process, stand in for finding orders or commands. And I think that's why, in addition to the fact that it's incredibly dehumanizing the way that often the rape of women is seen as lesser than in a context of war, that somehow, well, you were raped, but you survived, is often what so many of these survivors are told. I think it's incredibly important, and what you have done in the past to speak on this is incredible, and I can only applaud you for it. It's incredibly important to continue to reiterate to people that rape is a weapon of war. The fact that there are survivors left to give their testimony actually is only lucky for us, the international community, as we attempt to help people seek justice, because there are people to speak up on what was done to them. But it's not lucky in any other way. There is no woman that I have ever spoken to, or man, who is a survivor of sexual assault that has told me that they feel lucky. And it is appalling that somehow still, when we talk about this in the international judicial process, that we talk about victims and survivors of rape as a weapon of war almost as secondary.
Thank you for laying out so clearly and so powerfully how sexual violence and rape can be an act of genocide. There are so many things that I wish I had the time to comment on, because I just agree with everything that you said, and really, really appreciate your words today. Just before we wrap up, very quickly, yesterday, Ethiopia declared a state of emergency as the TPLF and the Oromo Liberation Army is advancing towards the capital. All sides seem committed to continuing the fighting. So, what does this mean for peace talks and in the future, and for peace in general in Ethiopia?
I think my concern is that the international community has lost its leverage by waiting this long to forcibly impress upon both sides that the peace talks, as the US has said, that peace is the only way out of this, that the only solution to the issues in Ethiopia, to the horrors that we've seen in Ethiopia, are negotiated solutions. The problem is that the world was not unified and was not firm in forcing that upon both sides equally. So consistently telling the TPLF, the Tigrayan forces, and now the Oromia forces, that they shouldn't move on Addis, that they shouldn't move out of their zones. It's very toothless to say that and try and enforce that on one side when you have consistently failed to enforce anything upon the other side, upon the Ethiopian government, in spite of the US State Department's own findings that what is happening in Ethiopia is ethnic cleansing. I feel sad at the number of missed opportunities that the international community has allowed to pass. And my worry is that now is when it matters, because it means that the international community will, and I hope I'm wrong, but may unfortunately not be seen as a credible interlocutor. And clearly they weren't, because the Oromia and the Tigrayan forces felt that they needed to get into a position of military upper hand to allow themselves to then be pushed into a negotiation. So I worry that already the point where lives could have been saved by the international community holding firm has passed. Hopefully now the international community won't squander this opportunity. I mean, we understand that those combined rebel fighting forces are sitting on the outskirts of Addis, and they have not yet chosen to move on Addis. And so part of that tells me that they're waiting to see what the US does next, and what the US Horn of Africa envoy does next, to signal to them what their next steps should be, whether there is an opportunity to claw back some kind of internationally monitored and internationally overseen process. And hopefully that can happen. But we can't keep squandering these opportunities. And the more we do, the less the opportunities will come around. And then we'll, unfortunately, I think, be looking at a full-blown civil war. And as the global community, asking ourselves, how did we get here? Well, I think it's very clear how we got here.
Thank you so much, Nima, for coming on Gendering Geopolitics. Thank you for speaking on how genocide does not just equal instances of mass killing. This is so important to understand, for bearing witness to survivors of rape and sexual violence in war, and for all of your work shining a spotlight on what's happening in Ethiopia and on what's happening in Tigray. So thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much for asking me on, and for giving this a platform. You guys have been so great at just continuing to kind of hammer home that this is happening. I think when so many people around the world have wished that it wasn't happening. So thank you so much.
Absolutely.